Welcome back. So usually when we consider how the universe functions, when we think about the strict mechanics of causality, there's this really deep-seated assumption of, like, mechanical precision.
Right, yeah.
We envision reality kind of like the inside of a vintage pocket watch.
Yeah.
You pry open the back casing, and there's the mainspring uncoiling, and it's transferring its stored energy to the center wheel, then to the third wheel, the fourth wheel.
All perfectly ordered.
Exactly. And you can point your finger directly at a specific turning gear and definitively state, that physical object right there is the cause generating the movement of the hands.
It's a really comforting mental model, honestly. We instinctively crave a reality that operates as a well-oiled machine, where every resultant effect has a solid, quantifiable, and historically traceable cause.
Yeah, totally.
And this mechanistic view isn't just a quirk of modern scientific thinking, right? It's basically the baseline conventional intuition of human perception.
Because it works for us on a daily basis.
Right. And even in the highly developed scholastic traditions of early Buddhism, like the Abhidharma, there was this massive concerted effort to map out these causal gears with absolute precision.
Categorizing everything.
Yeah, categorizing every primary cause and secondary condition to explain exactly how reality arises moment by moment.
But when you step into the world of Madhyamaka philosophy, and specifically when you read the deeper chapters of Nāgārjuna's Mūlamadhyamakakārikā, that pocket watch basically dissolves entirely.
It completely falls apart.
Yeah, and that's our mission for this deep dive. Because when you hit Chapter 20, the Sāmagrī, which is the analysis of the aggregate of causes and conditions, Nāgārjuna doesn't just argue that our understanding of the gears is flawed.
No, he goes much further than that.
He launches a meticulous assault on the assumption that the gears, the spring, and the movement ever possessed any inherent independent reality to begin with. He targets the very engine of production itself.
And the structural placement of Chapter 20 is really vital to understanding the weight of this assault, especially for those of you who've been following along with this text.
Right, because we have to remember where we've been.
Exactly. You'll recall that back in Chapter 1, the Prantiya-pariksa, Nāgārjuna dismantled the inherent causal power of individual conditions. He established early on that a single condition, existing in isolation, cannot inherently produce an effect.
Right.
Furthermore, in Chapter 19, he systematically deconstructed the inherent reality of time.
Which is huge. He basically removes the chronological framework we usually rely on to make sense of causality in the first place.
Yeah, so he's boxed his opponents in, which leaves those philosophical opponents and, honestly, our own conventional intuition with one final desperate refuge.
We retreat to the idea of the aggregate, right, the samagri.
That's the one.
We concede that, okay, maybe a single drop of water or a solitary ray of sunlight doesn't contain the inherent power to create a sprout. But surely, we think, when you combine the seed, the soil, the water, the sunlight, and the temperature into a collective aggregate, that combination possesses a unique, intrinsic power of production that the individual parts lacked.
That is precisely the Abhidharmic defense he's anticipating here. The argument is that the Sāmagrī acts as a unified producer.
Right.
So Nāgārjuna takes up this complex, highly nuanced scenario, the collective confluence of multiple factors acting together. And he forces us to examine the triad of causality.
Okay, let's lay out that triad. Step 1 of his reasoning.
Step 1. We have to identify the three spheres of this process. First, the aggregate of causes and conditions acting as the producer. Second, the action of production itself. And third, the final product or effect.
So cause, causality, and effect.
Exactly. And the objective of Chapter 20 is to subject this triad to the same relentless logical scrutiny we've seen applied to individual conditions.
To see if this collective can hold up as an ultimate reality. Okay, let me make sure I'm wrapping my head around this triad before we destroy it. Let's use the analogy of a symphony orchestra.
I like that. Go ahead.
If the strings are the cause and the woodwinds are the conditions, the symphony itself is the aggregate.
Right.
But conventionally, we think the symphony inherently produces the music. Are we really about to prove that an orchestra cannot inherently produce sound?
We absolutely are.
Oh.
We are about to dismantle the inherent reality of the orchestra as a singular producer.
Oh, wow. Okay, so where does Nāgārjuna even start with that?
To do that, he initiates what is essentially a spatial investigation. This is the first part of Step 2, applying the tetralemma.
Right, the four-cornered logic.
Exactly. If we accept the premise that this aggregate possesses the inherent power to produce an effect, we first have to locate that effect. Where does the product reside before it physically manifests?
In space.
In space, yeah.
Yeah.
In the opening verses, specifically verses 1 through 4, he brings the tetralemma to bear on the spatial relationship between the samagri and the effect it supposedly produces.
So let's look at the mechanics of the first position of the tetralemma, which is affirmation.
Right. The proposition is that the product must inherently exist within the aggregate prior to the act of production.
Basically, the music is already inside the orchestra before they play.
Exactly. The Padmakara translation of verse 1 poses the question quite directly. It says, if the result arising from the confluence of causes and conditions is within that confluence, how can it arise from such a confluence?
He's highlighting a fundamental redundancy there.
He really is.
Because if the effect already exists in its complete, absolute essence inside the cause, the entire process of production is rendered meaningless.
Yeah, why produce something that's already there?
Right. If the sprout is already entirely present within the aggregate of the seed and soil, it doesn't need to be produced.
Yeah.
It simply needs to be revealed.
And verse 3 takes this a step further by demanding empirical verification. If the result is genuinely residing within the confluence, it should be detectable.
Which is ridiculous, obviously. You can dissect a seed and analyze the surrounding soil down to the molecular level, and you will never locate an inherently existing microscopic sprout.
You won't. The ungraspability of the effect within the aggregate is fatal to the affirmative position.
Yeah.
But, the philosophical opponents of Madhyamaka often try to circumvent this by positing a theory of potential.
Oh, right, like the acorn and the oak tree?
Exactly. The Sautrantika school, for instance, relied heavily on the concept of seeds, or bisha, not literal botanical seeds, but latent karmic or causal potentials residing in a continuum.
They might argue that the product isn't physically present, but its absolute potential is embedded within the aggregate.
Yes.
And I can see the intuitive appeal of that. We look at an acorn and say the oak tree is in there as genetic potential.
It feels very natural to say that.
But applying Nāgārjuna's rigor, that defense seems to collapse into a semantic trick. Well, if we define potential as a real, inherent, fixed essence, like a metaphysical blueprint that possesses its own absolute reality, then we haven't actually escaped the first position of the tetralemma.
Right, because the essence is already present.
Exactly, making the act of production an illusion. Alternatively, if potential is merely a descriptive label we apply in hindsight once the oak tree has grown, then we're admitting it lacks inherent existence.
It's just a conventional designation at that point.
Yeah, which aligns perfectly with Madhyamaka, but totally fails to save the opponent's assertion of absolute causal power.
You nailed it. The Madhyamaka critique forces the opponent to choose between redundancy and conventionality. And since the opponent requires an inherently existent cause to generate an inherently existent effect, the affirmative position fails.
So they have to move to the next corner of the tetralemma.
Right. This forces the logical pivot to the second position, which is negation. If the product cannot be located within the aggregate, perhaps it is entirely absent from the aggregate prior to production.
And verses 2 and 4 dismantle this alternative with equal precision.
They do.
If the product does not exist within the combination of causes and conditions in any capacity whatsoever, then the aggregate lacks any intrinsic basis for producing it.
Right. Garfield's translation of verse 4 states, if the effect is not in the combination of causes and conditions, then actual causes and conditions would be like non-causes and non-conditions.
The implication there is a descent into complete acausality.
Total acausality, yeah. If there is an absolute absence of the effect within the aggregate, a total metaphysical disconnect, then there's no logical reason why that specific aggregate should produce that specific effect.
Because the seed and soil would be no more related to the sprout than a handful of crushed glass would be.
Exactly. If the sprout is completely other to the seed, then anything could theoretically produce anything, which violently violates observable conventional reality.
Right. Sand doesn't produce oil. And as peers in this study, we know the remaining positions of the tetralemma fall systematically here.
Right. The both and neither options.
Yeah. The product cannot be both contained and uncontained within the aggregate, because that is a direct logical contradiction requiring an entity to simultaneously possess and lack an essence.
It's nonsense.
And nor can it be neither contained nor uncontained, which basically strips the relationship of any coherent meaning. It renders it impossible to even articulate a theory of production.
So the spatial analysis concludes with a total failure to locate the causal mechanism. We cannot find the product residing inside the cause, nor outside it, nor both, nor neither.
The assumption that the samagri acts as a physical or spatial container for the effect is completely ruptured.
It is. But when the spatial link breaks down, the philosophical mind instinctively seeks refuge in a different dimension.
Time.
Time. If we can't find the product physically lurking within the cause, we assume it must be a matter of waiting. We assume the connection is chronological.
We tell ourselves, the seed doesn't contain the sprout spatially, it precedes it temporally, which moves us into the temporal analysis of causality, focusing on when exactly the aggregate meets the product it supposedly generates.
And Nāgārjuna addresses this temporal refuge across verses 5 through 8, and later verses 12 through 14. He evaluates the timing of causality by testing two primary hypotheses, simultaneity and separation.
Let's examine simultaneity first, which he targets in verse 7. The proposition is that the cause and the effect might coexist in time, overlapping perfectly in the moment of production.
But the moment you posit exact temporal overlap, you run into the exact same problem of redundancy we saw in the spatial analysis.
How so?
Well, if the aggregate and the product arise in the self-same moment, they exist side by side like two separate entities already fully formed.
Oh, right.
If they are completely simultaneous, the directional flow required for one to produce the other evaporates. You simply have two existing phenomena.
The necessity of the cause to generate the effect vanishes if the effect is already present alongside it.
Exactly. Simultaneity fails to provide a mechanism for change or arising. This forces the opponent to the more intuitive hypothesis, which is separation. The cause must precede the effect.
But this introduces severe ontological dilemmas of its own.
Massive ones. Consider this scenario in verse 6. If the causal aggregate ceases to exist before the product actually arises, how does the production occur?
Right. If the cause is entirely gone, if it has passed into non-existence, then the subsequent product is fundamentally uncaused.
It arises from a void, which is termed a hituka. It's logically absurd to claim that an entity which no longer exists can reach across the temporal divide to exert force on an entity that does not yet exist.
I often think about the conventional analogy of a relay race here.
Oh, that's a good one.
We imagine the runner holding the baton as the cause, the passing of the baton as the production, and the receiving runner as the effect.
Okay.
If we apply the simultaneity argument, both runners are holding the baton at the exact same time, running at the exact same speed. No transfer is actually taking place. They just both possess the object.
Right, no production.
But under the separation argument, the first runner drops the baton and completely vanishes from the track before the second runner even arrives in the zone.
The relay race analogy perfectly highlights the missing link.
Yeah.
But let's push the physical mechanics of that transfer even further to see how Nāgārjuna destroys it.
Okay.
What happens in that absolute infinitesimal picosecond of the actual pass? Verse 5 attacks the idea of a cause giving its causal power and then stopping.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Yeah, it argues that if a cause imparts its energy to a product and then ceases, it must inherently possess two distinct identities, the identity of the giver and the identity of that which is stopped.
Which shatters the concept of svabhava.
Exactly.
Because if the causal aggregate has an absolute inherent essence, it must be singular and unchanging. The moment it splits into a phase of acting and a phase of ceasing, it's no longer a permanent, singular entity. It's a composite of changing states.
Precisely why Nāgārjuna moves to thoroughly dismantle the concept of concomitance. That supposed meeting or continuous connection of cause and effect across time, which he covers in verses 12 through 14.
Right.
He systematically exhausts every possible temporal combination to prove that a meeting between an inherently existent cause and effect is impossible.
And the text is just relentless here. Verse 12 states, there is no concomitance of a past product with a past cause, a future cause, or a present cause.
And he repeats this logical structure for a present product in verse 13 and a future product in verse 14.
Because if you treat past, present, and future as inherently real compartmentalized states, the temporal bridge collapses.
It has to. A past effect cannot meet a past cause because they're both finished, their existence exhausted.
Right.
A past effect cannot meet a present or future cause because the effect has already occurred. And if you analyze a present effect, it cannot meet a past cause because that cause has ceased.
It can't meet a future cause because the cause hasn't arisen.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it cannot meet a present cause due to the simultaneity redundancy we've already refuted.
Man. So we arrive at verse 15, which delivers the fatal blow to the temporal argument. If there is no meeting between the cause and the effect, how can a result be engendered?
You can't.
And even if we grant the impossible and say there is a meeting, How is a result engendered? Because if they meet, they are simultaneous and redundant. If they don't meet, they're disconnected and acausal.
The chronological framework we rely on to justify causality turns out to be just as hollow as the spatial one.
Which is terrifying for the ego, honestly.
It really is.
So the failure of both spatial and temporal frameworks pushes the analysis into its most profound phase, which is the examination of identity.
Right, the identity tetralemma.
Because if causality isn't a physical transfer and it isn't a temporal sequence, the opponent must argue that the connection is fundamentally essential or philosophical.
And Nāgārjuna covers this in verses 9 through 11. And brings it to a really sharp point in verses 19 through 21. We must determine whether the cause and the product are fundamentally identical in essence or entirely different.
Let's look at verse 19, which states that it is never tenable for the cause and the fruit to be one.
Right.
Because if the aggregate of causes and conditions is inherently identical to the product it generates, then production is nothing more than self-creation.
The producer and the produced collapse into the exact same metaphysical entity.
Right. If the seed is literally essentially identical to the sprout, then no transformation has occurred. It's just the entity continuously being itself.
And the refutation of self-production is a absolute cornerstone of Madhyamaka. But the alternative, complete difference, is equally untenable.
Verse 20 argues that if the cause and the fruit are inherently different, then a cause is logically equivalent to a non-cause.
Let's unpack that with an example.
Okay, if we look at the idea of transformation, say burning a piece of wood to produce ash.
Good example.
Our conventional intuition tells us an essence has undergone a change. We don't view the wood and the ash as completely disconnected phenomena.
Right.
But if we posit that the wood and the ash share absolutely zero essential identity, if they are 100% fundamentally different in their inherent nature, then we have severed the causal tether.
You have. The wood has no more intrinsic relation to the ash than a cloud of water vapor does. If difference is absolute, anything can produce anything. And that intuition about transformation is exactly the trap Nāgārjuna is exposing. Transformation implies an underlying permanent essence, a fundamental woodness that persists while merely changing its outward manifestation into ashness.
But that violates the definition of an inherent essence, or svabhava.
By definition, an absolute essence is immutable. If it is truly permanent, it cannot change into something else. If it does change, then it was never a permanent essence to begin with.
Wow. Which brings us to verse 21, summarizing the dilemma of essential existence. If the effect possesses an existence in and of itself, what is it that the cause produces? If the effect has no existence in and of itself, what is it that the cause produces?
The logic is airtight. If the product already possesses its own absolute essence, it is unproducible. Self-production is refuted.
Right.
If it completely lacks that essence and is entirely other, it's still unproducible, because you cannot bridge an absolute ontological gap. Other production is refuted.
Identity and difference are both revealed to be empty concepts. They're mere mental overlays we force onto a fluid reality.
So look at where we are. We systematically exhausted every logical position. We applied the rigorous framework of the tetralemma to space, time, and identity.
We tested for affirmation, negation, both, and neither in every category.
And at every single juncture, the concept of the Sāmagrī possessing inherent causal power breaks down into contradiction, redundancy, or absurdity.
The causal machine we started with has been completely dismantled. The pocket watch is shattered.
It's gone. And this exhaustive deconstruction is the necessary precursor to the central realization of the text, which is steps 3 and 4 of our progression.
Right. Emptiness and dependent origination.
Exactly. Because every extreme alternative regarding the 3 spheres of causality, the cause, the production of the product, leads to logical breakdown, we must conclude that these spheres are utterly empty of inherent existence.
And they lack any independent, absolute, or fixed reality. This is the realization of sunyata.
Yes. And verses 15 through 18 and later 22 through 24 really drive the implications of this emptiness home.
Verse 17 states, "An effect that is not empty cannot come to be. An effect that is not empty cannot cease to be."
This is where we must distinguish Nāgārjuna's emptiness from nihilism, which is super important.
Crucial.
He's not saying that effects do not conventionally arise. He's arguing that if an effect were truly non-empty, if it possessed a solid, independent, unchanging core, it could never originate.
Because it would already eternally exist in its absolute state.
Exactly. Similarly, it could never be destroyed because its absolute nature would render it impervious to change.
So the very fact that things do arise and cease in our observable reality is the ultimate proof that they must be empty.
Bingo. Emptiness isn't the negation of causality, it's the prerequisite for it.
And verses 22 through 24 extend this to the aggregate itself. Since the aggregate does not inherently produce itself, it cannot inherently possess the power to produce an effect.
Right.
The stark opposition we conventionally perceive between cause and effect is not a relationship between real, absolute opposites.
Which brings us to the profound conceptual pivot of dependent origination, or pratityanupada. Because the three spheres are empty of a rigid essence, they are fluid.
Their emptiness allows them to be inseparable, dependently co-originated, and deeply interdependent.
They do not exist as isolated building blocks of reality that occasionally bump into each other. They co-emerge and co-evolve.
They are co-imputed by the mind. A cause is only designated as a cause in relation to the manifestation of an effect. An effect only carries that label because we retroactively identify a cause that preceded it. They mutually define each other, existing solely as designations, names, and conventional tools we use to categorize the uninterrupted flow of phenomena.
The interdependence is absolute. You cannot have the concept of a producer without a product, nor the act of production without both. They arise together conceptually.
You know, I always think about the concept of the equator here.
The equator, yeah, tell me.
If you travel down to Ecuador, you aren't going to trip over a massive red line painted across the Earth's crust.
No, you're not.
The equator doesn't inherently exist as a physical object with its own svabhava, yet it is a dependently originated concept.
Oh.
We co-define it in relation to the poles, the axis of rotation, and the coordinate system we've developed to navigate the globe.
It's completely relational.
It is entirely empty of inherent physical existence, but it is an incredibly functional, vital designation for our conventional reality.
The equator is an excellent parallel for how Madhyamaka views the three spheres of causality. This dynamic perfectly illustrates step 5, the union of the two truths, which is central to understanding chapter 20.
The ultimate truth is emptiness, the lack of inherent essence. And the conventional truth is dependent origination, the functional reality of cause and effect.
And Nāgārjuna's brilliance is showing that these two truths are not in opposition. Phenomena are empty precisely because they are dependently originated.
If they had a fixed essence, they couldn't depend on anything else.
Exactly. Conversely, they can dependently originate only because they are empty. It's their lack of rigidity that allows the seed to transform into the sprout.
So the aggregate, the production, and the product are highly useful conventional tools, but they must never be mistaken for absolutes.
Never. And when we fully internalize this union of the two truths, we are forced into step 6. We conclude that the three spheres of causality operate much like illusions.
Right. They are often described in the text as being like reflections in a mirror, a mirage on a desert highway, a dream, or an echo.
They share the hallmark characteristic of being there yet not there.
Like when you shout into a canyon and hear an echo, you are undeniably experiencing a phenomenon. The sound hits your eardrum.
Right.
But if you try to locate the inherent independent source of that specific secondary sound within the empty air of the canyon, you will find nothing.
Nothing at all.
It's a dependently originated illusion. It's a confluence of your vocal cords, the air pressure, and the geometry of the rock walls. It functions conventionally, but it has no absolute core.
However, navigating this illusory nature requires immense philosophical care. The most common pitfall when studying Madhyamaka, and one that Nāgārjuna vehemently guards against, is conflating ultimate truth with conventional truth.
Which leads directly to nihilism.
Directly to it.
This is a crucial point for anyone trying to practically integrate this philosophy. Because if my actions are merely echoes and the causal aggregate is a mirage, why should I concern myself with the consequences of my behavior?
Right, that's the trap.
If stealing money or donating to charity are just empty causes leading to empty effects, it feels like a philosophical permission slip to abandon ethics entirely. If it's all an illusion, why does it matter?
That reaction stems from taking the ultimate truth, that phenomena lack inherent essence, and aggressively misapplying it to the conventional realm of karma and ethics.
It's mixing the categories.
Completely. Let's return to the mirage analogy. If you are wandering in a desert, dying of dehydration, and you see a shimmering mirage of a lake on the horizon, understanding that the water is a mirage is ultimately true.
Yeah.
It saves you from the delusion and exhaustion of running toward it and trying to drink sand.
But knowing the mirage is empty doesn't magically cure your physical dehydration.
Exactly the point. While you exist conventionally in a human body, conventional thirst requires conventional water. The conventional reality of karma, the ethical law of cause and effect, is driven entirely by dependent origination. It functions securely because it is fluid and empty. Your actions shape your future experiential reality precisely because there is no fixed, permanent self that is immune to change.
So nihilism, the belief that nothing matters and consequences don't exist, is a stance of absolute negation.
Yes, and as we've just seen in our analysis of the tetralemma, absolute negation is one of the extreme views that Madhyamaka utterly destroys.
That distinction is vital. Nihilism attempts to establish non-existence as a new absolute rule, but we've already proven there are no absolutes.
None.
So having deconstructed the causal aggregate, established the union of the two truths, and sidestepped the trap of nihilism, we have to elevate our analytical framework even further.
Step 7.
We apply the generalized tetralemma to the entirety of the three spheres.
Right. Up to this point, we use the tetralemma to scrutinize specific properties.
Yeah.
Spatial location, temporal sequence, and essential identity.
To see how they function.
Yeah. Now, we zoom out and apply it to the very nature of reality itself. We can affirmatively state that the cause, the causality, and the effect are not this, they're not non-this, they're not both, and they are not neither.
And most importantly, there is no secret fifth option waiting to be discovered.
No hidden escape hatch. This means we have exhausted the limits of human conceptualization. We are completely out of metaphysical boxes.
The true nature of the three spheres exists entirely beyond all conditioned, dualistic, conceptual proliferation, what the tradition calls prapanka.
Yes. Reality cannot be captured by our fabricated models, our triads, or our dyads. The moment you attempt to pin reality down with a definitive concept, it escapes.
Because reality itself is not a concept.
Which demands a radical shift in our philosophical orientation. If we cannot conceptually grasp reality, how do we engage with it? We engage the middle way, the Madhyamaka.
And we must be incredibly precise about what middle signifies in this context.
Very precise. It is not a lukewarm compromise between two opposing viewpoints. It's not a synthesis. The middle way is a state of perfect, radical freedom from all extremes. We transcend the affirmation of this and the negation of non-this, and we equally reject the conceptual middle grounds of both and neither.
By doing so, we are systematically abandoning every major metaphysical ibphism.
Every single one.
We abandon objectivism and realism, the belief that the universe is constructed of solid, independent building blocks acting upon each other. We abandon subjectivism, idealism, and solipsism, the notion that reality is merely a projection of the mind and nothing external exists.
We also transcend relationism and processism. The idea that while objects aren't real, the processes or relationships between them are the ultimate reality.
Even that is too rigid.
Way too rigid. And we even transcend monism, or radical oneness, the belief that the universe is just one giant, undifferentiated, absolute substance.
The middle way drops all of these conceptual frameworks because they all attempt to reify some aspect of reality into an absolute.
And this brings us to the most critical transition of our deep dive, steps 10 and 11.
Because a philosophy of this magnitude cannot remain purely academic, right? It must eventually become a lived practice.
It has to.
We have to walk away from this text and interact with a world full of pain, joy, commerce, and relationships. How do we practically interact with a causal aggregate that we now know is completely empty of inherent reality?
The answer lies in using these conventions without attachment. We can, and functionally we must, use the aggregate of causes and conditions conventionally.
They are indispensable tools.
Exactly. If you are attempting to build a business, you must assemble the conventional causes and conditions: capital, a viable product, labor, market timing.
Right.
If you are trying to heal a sick friend, you must gather the conditions: medical care, empathy, physical rest. The philosophical shift does not change what you do in the conventional world. It fundamentally alters how you relate to what you are doing.
You continue to engage the process of causality, but you drop the delusion of absolute control over it.
You engage causality without reification, without the frantic, anxiety-driven effort that assumes you can force an absolute outcome.
Because you know its true nature.
Yes. You act with the full knowledge of its true, dependently originated, fluid nature. You relinquish the samsaric illusion of mastery.
You plant the seed in the soil, and you provide the water, but you do not suffer existential collapse if a sudden flood washes the soil away.
Right, because you never harbored the delusion that you possessed absolute inherent control over an inherently existing product in the first place.
Relinquishing the illusion of mastery removes the neurotic grip we have on our actions and their results.
It frees you up.
And when that frantic grasping ceases, it clears the space for the spiritual apex of this philosophy, which is perceiving primordial purity.
This is the ultimate realization that flows from emptiness. Because all phenomena are empty, independently originated, because they lack rigid boundaries, because there is no isolated selfish essence separating one entity from the rest of the universe, we can perceive everything as primordially equal.
The aggregate of causes, the act of production, the final product. Because they are empty, they are all perfectly pure, complete, and divine exactly as they are.
They are one, but strictly in a non-dual sense. Not many, not one, not both, not neither. They share the same fundamental nature of suchness.
Because they are completely empty of self-nature, there is no ultimate ontological friction between them.
There is no absolute clash of essences. There is only the uninterrupted flow of dependent origination. We simply abide in reality as it is, suchness, without violently trying to force it into our conceptual boxes.
It is a staggering philosophical arc, honestly.
It really is.
We begin chapter 20 by aggressively dismantling the mechanics of the universe. We take a logical sledgehammer to the spatial container of the aggregate, the temporal sequence of production, and the essential identity of the cause and effect.
We shatter the pocket watch completely.
And yet, through that total deconstruction, we arrive at a place where the universe is recognized as perfectly pure and functionally beautiful precisely because it is not a rigid machine.
It's the shift from a universe of mechanical constraints to a universe of infinite fluid interdependence.
To crystallize this journey for everyone studying alongside us, let's just recap. We immersed ourselves in Nāgārjuna's Samagrī. We analyzed the triad of causality, the producer, the production, and the product.
Right.
We applied the tetralemma to demonstrate that their relationship cannot be established spatially, temporally, or essentially without falling into contradiction.
Which led us to the unavoidable conclusion of emptiness.
Which in turn reveals that all phenomena are dependently co-originated and merely conventional designations. We navigated the union of the two truths to avoid the abyss of nihilism, viewing causality as a functional illusion.
And by engaging the middle way and abandoning all conceptual extremes, we learned to use the aggregate conventionally without attachment.
Ultimately arriving at the perception of primordial purity and suchness.
It's a profound progression.
Mm-hmm.
But as we conclude this intensive exploration, there's one final lingering realization that must be addressed. A concept that prevents Madhyamaka from becoming just another rigid dogma.
Oh, I know what you're going to say.
You must contemplate the emptiness of emptiness itself.
This is where the philosophy turns back on itself to ensure no concepts survive to be worshipped.
Exactly. We have spent this entire time proving that dependent origination is empty, that it is devoid of inherent existence due to its relational nature.
Right.
But logic dictates that if dependent origination is empty, then emptiness itself, which is a concept defined entirely in dependence on the things that are empty, must also lack inherent existence.
Emptiness is not a dark, static void.
It is not an ultimate absolute substance hiding behind the curtain of conventional reality. Emptiness itself is merely another conventional tool, a medicine used to cure the disease of reification.
Once the disease is cured, you must drop the medicine.
Do not cling to emptiness as a new absolute truth. Let even the concept of emptiness dissolve into suchness.
We started our analysis searching for the gears, the mainspring, the solid mechanical engine of causality. Nāgārjuna opened the casing and revealed that there are no gears, there is no spring, and there is no solid engine.
None of it's there.
Yet the hands of conventional reality continue to move. It is a breathtaking, empty, interdependent mirage. Thank you for engaging in this rigorous exploration with us. Step out into the world, plant your seeds, water your soil, use the conventional tools at your disposal, but remember to simply observe the beautiful, empty mirage of causality unfolding in your own life.